Welcome to 10-Minute Product Management. My name is Nilaus, and today we're going to talk about bottlenecks. Well, the idea is that you should not fear and fight your bottlenecks. You should embrace them and elevate them. So that's the topic of today's episode. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to identify what is a bottleneck, basically what constitutes a bottleneck. Well, if you have a production process, in this case, I will talk both from a perspective of a physical production, like a factory, or from an agile delivery, agile software development perspective. So in any case, if you have a production process that goes through a number of steps, the bottleneck is the activity or process or machine or person that defines the throughput of the entire process. Basically, it means that in any production before the bottleneck is going to be wasted or at least built for stockpile because it cannot go through the bottleneck, and any production in the chain after the bottleneck, well, that can't be produced because it's waiting for the bottleneck. So things before a bottleneck is producing to stockpile, and things after a bottleneck is having idle time. And that's how you kind of identify where the bottleneck is. That's also something that there are a lot more mechanics to do this from a factory production perspective than from a software or general organizational perspective. It is harder to see if a specialist, a knowledge worker specialist, is idle than to see if a machine is idle. Nonetheless, there are tools for it. It is possible. It's something you need to do. So that's how we identify a bottleneck. Now, the bottleneck could be an organizational perspective, it could be a key resource where you always have to ask that person for advice. You just, well, let's just ask him. Oh, sorry, he's busy. All right, we can't proceed until we go through that person. That can be a product owner, it could be a product specialist, it can be a manager who needs to approve, it can be some function that always needs to approve things like a change management function, and things just pile up in front in order to be processed. Or solution architect, there could be lots of different things from an organizational perspective. On the production side, it can be some kind of process and count the machine that is either slower or has a more lengthy task or is producing or is a constraint for many different processes. Then that can be the bottleneck. So that's the bottleneck, and the normal response to a bottleneck is remove it. We must remove the bottlenecks because then we increase production. Well, it's not that simple. That's what I'm basically want to tell you. It's not that simple to just remove the bottleneck, because let's work on some examples. I have a factory, a machine here. This is a big shiny machine and it can do a lot of processes, and it's always the one, it's fully utilized. It's working all the time and things are just queuing up in front of it, and things are idling, machines are idling after this machine. Wow, this is our bottleneck. How about getting 2 of those machines? Well, that's a big capital investment potentially. It's also requires more coordination, maintenance, write-offs, all the stuff, more people to support it, all that stuff. And by the time you have 2 machines, well, what if it's only 120% loaded? Then you have 2 machines operating at or at the combined 60% capacity. That's not a good investment. Similarly, from an organizational perspective, if I have a product owner who is my bottleneck and I want to hire an extra product owner, well, first of all, it's not easy to find more product owners. Like, it's a large capital investment to buy a new machine. It's also a large capital investment and very difficult to find these key resources, and it takes time to ramp them up and get them up to speed. But even granting we do that and that's successful, well, they're going to have to coordinate to pass things on between them, and that means they're not going to be 200% productive. They're going to be less than 200, whatever is. However, there's also the perspective, if the original key resource was 120% loaded, well, now we have 2, and can you identify that these 2 resources are now 60% loaded each? It's harder, right? It's not that easy. We're not talking about someone who works on specific tasks and you can measure it directly. This is knowledge work. So you also have to fight the concept of work expense to fill the time allocated. And therefore it's difficult. Plus you need more coordination, more management, more facilitation, more meetings. All that comes in, all the overhead comes in when you just double up the resource. And worst of all, once you've done that, you will get additional productivity. But the problem is now either the process before or after is then becoming the bottleneck. Let's say in case of a product owner, then suddenly the product owner handles all the things, or the product owners, because we've now removed the bottleneck. They can just push things to production easily. Well, now the developers are the bottlenecks, or the testers, or whoever else is involved in that part. And then you need to fix that problem by scaling up the production team. And again, more investment. Looking at the other direction of the chain, upstream, well, if the product owner can handle any request, all requirements coming in, and push them straight through the production, the development, well, you're also at risk of not good ideas, not good enough ideas passing through, because there's idle capacity. And therefore, it is not always desirable to remove the bottleneck internally in the production. If you are actually, however, completely successful and remove all the bottlenecks in your production environment, well, you haven't really removed the bottleneck, have you? You've just pushed it outside of the factory or outside of your production, because now the salespeople or the customers become the bottleneck. And that means you have an overinvestment of production facilities to meet a demand that isn't there. That's a bad investment. So also in case of a production facility, a factory, yeah, you can have a bottleneck that, as described, a machine that can do a lot of different things. And that will be the bottleneck. And again, this will then constrain the entire cycle. Now let's look at what I propose to do instead, is that you find the bottleneck, not just identify them, but you also design where you want the bottleneck. Because in a production facility, you want to choose which process is the bottleneck. Generally, you could say the most expensive, or the most, generally the most expensive, but you could have other criteria. The most risky, the most quality sensitive, it should be the bottleneck, so that you design around it. If you have one number of processes that are cheap, very expensive, cheap, you want to design that it's the expensive process in the middle that is, or the expensive machine for that matter, that is the bottleneck of the entire plant. And in order to do that, you have to look at what it is doing. And this is the part about elevating the bottleneck. If you have a factory floor and you have a machine there, this machine is a new fancy machine that can do everything. Well, it's very important that it does not do everything, because if this machine is doing it can do process A and process B. Process A can be done by other machines that are cheaper. Maybe they're more expensive actually. Maybe they're slower. Maybe they're old, whatever. But process B can only be done by your bottleneck machine. In that case, it's tempting to say, hey, let's use the good machine to make high quality, easy and fast, except you've now constrained your entire facility by having a bottleneck machine do non-bottleneck tasks. In this case, it's much more valuable to take tasks away from your bottleneck and make sure the bottleneck is performing bottleneck activities, and only that. Similarly, from a organizational perspective, let's say we have a product owner or a solution architect who is the bottleneck of a process. Instead of just hiring more resources, my proposal is to say there are tasks that a product owner or solution architect should not do, and it is our job as managers to make sure that they do not engage in activities that are not utilizing their unique skills. For example, a product owner or a solution architect, for example, should not do testing, should not do support, should be doing the absolute minimum requirement in terms of reporting and status meetings. That is our job as managers, to make sure that our bottleneck resources are doing bottleneck tasks and moving other tasks away. Thereby, you can get higher utilization of the entire process without hiring more resources. Because you can then if you can take a task that the bottleneck, the product owner, for example, can do, and any other specialist, developer, stakeholder can do, you want to move that away so you free up the bottleneck for bottleneck activities. And that will give us a lot more throughput at not really any cost, because it's more There's also the part about there are people who have unique skills and they are not easy to replace. They're not easy to recruit either. And because of that, you want to make sure that they do the stuff that only they can do. And that's also the case here. It's similar to our machine that can do a lot of things, but should only do the stuff that only this machine can do. So that's basically how I propose to engage it. You identify the bottlenecks, you design where you want the bottlenecks, and then you embrace the bottlenecks and elevate them so that they only work on bottleneck activities, and thereby you can increase the throughput of the entire process without additional investment. That's something that I find it's really important to keep in mind when optimizing any type of process. So that's basically it. As always, I also have a reading recommendation, and obviously this is going to be Eliyahu Goldratt's The Goal. This is the Bible of constraint management, or theory of constraints. It is absolutely brilliant read. I highly recommend it for anyone who has any interest in process optimization or constraint management, or it's just so applicable to so many things, and it's a good read on that. So I hope you found this episode interesting. I hope you'll be joining me for another installment as this series, I am picking this series back up again. Thank you very much for joining. Hope you liked it. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe and all that good YouTube stuff. And I'll be seeing you another time. Thank you.